Hello and welcome to another thrilling episode of the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be continuing our commentary and analysis on the Vladimir Putin speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And so let's just dig right into it.
Rather, we expanded contacts with reliable and responsible partners in those countries and regions that act as the drivers of the world economy as of now. And I would like to emphasize that these are the markets of the future, and everyone understands that full well. Leaders of these countries do not give in to external pressure, which is often very presumptuous. They are guided not by someone else's, but rather by their.
Okay, so interesting aspect here is he wants to work with resilient countries that don't cave to external pressure such as the West and specifically the United States. And that means something specific. That means that if you want to work with Russia and with China and with countries like them, it's actually better if you don't work with the United States, because these countries, Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, they don't want to work with countries like America or with countries that could be influenced by America. And so if you decouple from America, that's one way of indicating that you're not going to be pressured by economic threats that the United States might lobby against you. And so this is showing that a new front to this war between the West and the rest is forming, where if you want to have agreements with certain countries, it's actually better to not be potentially influenced by the United States.
National interests, and with the countries of this type, the volume of our bilateral trade has increased by dozens of percentage points and sometimes several-fold, and they continue to grow. And this is yet another testimony to the fact that common sense, the verve of business, objective market laws are far stronger than the current political climate, and that means that the unsightly, essentially neo-colonial international system has ceased to exist, whereas the multipolar world order is getting ever stronger. This process is inevitable. In general, last year,
So notice the tone shift. This process of a multipolar world is inevitable. If you had asked these people a few years ago, they would have said it's likely going to occur sometime in the future. Calling it inevitable now means that they recognize America is on a steep decline, and there's really nothing America could do to stop a multipolar world from happening at this point. And I really think the pivot point was during the pandemic. There were so many different things happening, like America not being able to handle its supply chain and get even simple goods like Q-tips and masks and toilet paper and stuff like that, that the rest of the world recognized the weakness of America, and America didn't have a cohesive policy. It didn't have a united front for the pandemic. And so the rest of the world recognizes this, and they pivoted. They recognized that a multipolar world is inevitable. So this language he's using, this very strong, decisive language, that's not just a bluff. It's not just a front. He's completely confident that this is going to be happening sooner or later, a multipolar world. That end of history that the United States was talking about after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was just an end of one era. And now we're entering the new era of a multipolar world. And so interesting times. But I just wanted you to catch that complete confidence in the multipolar world. It's very exciting.
trade export achieved new record highs, rising to $592 billion US dollars. 1/3 of that export was non-commodities and non-energy products. And what's hiding behind that figure is 6.4 million jobs, as well as 2.2 trillion rubles of tax payments to the Russian consolidated budget. I would like to point out that the supplies of our agri-industrial sector have reached new highs, rising to the tune of more than $41 billion for 10 years in a row. Russia, unfortunately, is among the world's top 5 grain exporters, and starting from 2016, we are the world's biggest supplier of wheat. And we have grounds to believe that this year, too, our...
Okay, so the closed captions are not particularly accurate. He said wheat instead of weed, wheat, and instead of unfortunately, it was I believe it was unfalteringly. So yeah, just try to tune in to what is being said instead of the subtitles, the AI subtitles that are created. It's gotten better, don't get me wrong, speech recognition, but it still has a little bit of a way to go. Actually, there's an interesting graph I'm going to be doing a video on later, showing just the progress of different AI technologies, and speech recognition is one of them, where it went, like, it had no progress for decades, and then all of a sudden it just exploded into essentially human-like speech recognition. But we'll get to that in another video.
Our companies are going to make yet another step forward, achieving new record highs in terms of wheat exports. That said, Russia is going to take an active part in ensuring global food security, providing aid to those countries, and African countries too, that are suffering from shortages of food. From January to April, we have a surplus in our trade balance of $22.6 billion. It's a little more than the first quarter.
So, interesting aspect there, talking about surpluses. You could almost think, I mean, we tend to think of the conflict as the East versus the West, and it kind of works, sort of. I mean, in terms of the major powers, it is the East versus the West. But when you look at the alliance as a whole, it really is consumers versus producers. The consumer nations, which have been dictating prices of goods for decades, if not centuries now, they have a very colonial mindset, colonialist mindset. They are on one side, and they all have trade deficits. Except for, I'd have to look, but I don't know if Germany has a trade deficit. They are a major trade power still, but most of the other Western powers have trade deficits. They're consumer nations, and they've been dominant for decades. And I'm not hearing people really talk about it, but it's the producer nations that are challenging these consumer nations that are heavily in debt. And it's countries like Russia, countries like China that have huge trade surpluses that are going, well, wait a minute, you're just printing money over there, and you're getting value from that printed money while we're doing all the hard work. And actually, we want our fair share. And so, interesting way of looking at it. Instead of East versus West, look at it as those with trade surplus versus those with trade deficits, or a simpler way of putting it, consumers versus producer economies.
And in 2022, the surplus of our current accounts stood at $233 billion. I would like to emphasize that these resources has to be actively employed for the benefit of Russia's economic development. We need to import cutting-edge equipment and technology, spare parts and materials. I would like to request that the government and the Bank of Russia should come up with concrete proposals on using the funds Russia's getting from high levels of export to stimulate investment, how to expand these investment into systemically important projects in infrastructure, logistics, and territorial development. These projects will allow us to expand the Russian business capacities across a wide range of sectors, raising its competitiveness, including in global markets. But of course, in these markets, Russia has not only partners but also ill-wishers who have grown accustomed to getting excess profits due to their dominant and monopolist position in the market, and they don't want other countries to have an alternative to their aircraft, vessels, medicines, banking systems, technologies, and other goods and services. But even such participants of the market do not need any rivals. And this is why they're putting spokes in our wheels, trying to contain new centers of development as they...
Okay, a few points here. One is the West likes to be like, oh, you can't have your government support your businesses. That's not fair. But the West absolutely supports their businesses abroad to make sure that business interests and government interests, national interests, completely align. So they will destabilize countries and provide competitive advantages for their own corporations to extract valuable rare earth resources from places like Peru, from Chile, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. And so the West likes to have one set of rules for themselves and a separate set of rules for other countries when it comes to the nation state helping to benefit corporations. And they already have an unfair advantage, the mega corporations in the West, because they have decades of experience in these various markets. And a lot of these countries are just starting out their domestic corporations. And so there's this huge experiential advantage that the rest of the world needs to help their mega corporations around. And they're not really mega corporations because they have a lot of tiny corporations that are trying to fight these behemoths. Another thing worth considering here is, man, I still remember back when I was tutoring various political science classes, and I remember reading in the textbooks like how good it was that you had these supply chains and various economies all working on one project, and how everything needs to be all spread out throughout the world. And I just remember thinking like, well, this is what the textbook is saying, and I'm tutoring on it, but it's like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, what happens if these countries just don't get along? And it's just like, the textbook never got into that. It was never like, well, if people don't get along, there's redundancy in the system. No, there's never redundancy in the system when it comes to these supply chains. And so you have to recognize you have to have some degree of backup, some degree of redundancy. You have to have some alternatives in the system. Ideally, those alternatives would be domestic. So you don't have to like trust others in order to get, especially your basic needs met. But we're seeing that whether it's basic needs or more advanced things, that the Western economy is just, they had these long, unwieldy supply chains that had no redundancy in the system. And even after realizing it was a problem, especially during the pandemic, they didn't fix it. They didn't provide redundancy. They wanted to have as large of profits as possible, and so they just didn't do anything to resolve any of the problems. But you're seeing countries like Russia, countries like China, that are thinking like, okay, well, if we don't have reliable trade partners, or if our partners are pressured by America to not work with us, we need to have alternatives, ideally domestic alternatives. And that makes complete sense. But you won't hear that from a political science textbook, because these various textbooks, they're pushing the propaganda line of big business and big government.
They say they're trying to cancel them, but such attempts are only leading to Western countries canceling their own business reputation, and that is a steep price to pay, unfortunately.
Okay, so this is the comment I'm going to leave you on, and then we can come back to this later. But the West, and this really should get its own video. The West believes that its reputation, its trust over time really doesn't matter. And it kind of makes sense, because democracies, the way they work is it's different people in charge, or at least different figureheads, right? And so what will happen is some, let's just say Democrat, will make an agreement with Vladimir Putin, and maybe the successor doesn't follow that agreement anymore. And the successor could be another Democrat, or it could be a Republican, or whatever. It's usually those two parties. We haven't had alternatives in quite a while. But in a democracy, they don't really have to hold to any of their agreements. And for the longest time, I would say decades, other countries were just like, oh, this is a new administration. Yeah, I understand they're doing things differently, so they're not going to hold to the agreements of past administrations. And they just let that happen. But then they're starting to realize, and I think they fully realize at this point, that these countries do have a consistent foreign policy. It's just when they break agreements for new administrations, that's part of their tactics. That's part of their competitive advantage. And then, so what you have to do is you have to hold accountable these countries saying, well, yes, you change from one Democrat to another, or you change from a Democrat to a Republican, or a Republican to a Democrat, et cetera, et cetera. But you still have the same foreign policy. What you're doing is you're just screwing us over and not following the agreements that your prior administrations had. And so this is an element of democracies that I just do not think are functional whatsoever. It's an element of democracies that I just don't think are functional whatsoever, because you have to have a consistent policy. For others to be able to trust you and cooperate with you, you have to have a consistent policy. They have to know that if you make an agreement, you're a person of your word. You're a nation of your word. And so what he's saying here is, whenever the United States goes back on its word, which happens consistently, it's gone back on the Iran agreement. It went back on agreements it made with the Soviet Union before it collapsed about not expanding east. It goes back on agreements nonstop. And it just like does this like coy, like innocent act of like, oh, but that was a prior administration. I don't have to follow any of that. Blah, 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 blah. You're seeing that these countries aren't buying it anymore. Okay? And so that's what I'll leave you with. We'll have an entire video on trust and cooperation and how the United States has been using democracy to its advantage to kind of reset trust and cooperation, when really trust and cooperation is an iterative game. I would recommend you study game theory a little bit to understand what I'm talking about there. But so yeah, that's where we'll leave you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more content, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.